We continue this morning our look at what it means to be a cheerful giver. And I thought we'd just remind ourselves as we do this that giving is not something that God sort of ginned up at the last minute to sort of help the church meet its finances. That giving has been at the center of what it means to worship and serve God from the very beginning. The very first worship that we're told about in the Bible was when Abel sacrificed out of his flock. And then throughout the Old Testament, worship centered around that act of animal sacrifice, the sharing of and giving of, a burning of often an animal on the altar. Now that sort of had a dual purpose, where at first it was an act of atonement. It foreshadowed that without the shedding of blood there can be no forgiveness, that the innocent blood of the animal stood in place of the guilty sin of the worshiper, sort of foreshadowing what Jesus would do on the cross. But there was also a financial aspect to that. Every time somebody offered an animal to sacrifice, it depleted their flocks or herds. It made them that much poorer as they made this financial gift to God. When David was offered the threshing floor of Araunah to build an altar and give a sacrifice, he was offered to give it for free, and he responded, "No, I'm going to buy it because I will not offer to the Lord that which costs me nothing." That our service to God is supposed to have a cost that goes along with it, not just a monetary cost, but sometimes that as well. In Proverbs 14 and verse 31, whoever opposes the poor shows contempt for their maker, but whoever is kind to the needy honors God. When we use our finances to help other people, it's an act of service and worship to God Himself. And so all through the Old Testament, this expectation, Israel is told not to be stingy, not to be closed fists, but to share with those in need. They were prevented, if somebody was hurting financially, needed to borrow money, they were forbidden to charge interest. It was to be an act of brotherhood, an act of fellowship, an act of community in Israel. People that had land, that farmed that land, were forbidden to clear the whole thing. When they harvested, they were commanded not to go over it a second time, but to leave something in the field so that those who had nothing could go there and glean and get what they needed. And then they were, a tenth of the harvest was dedicated to God, and they were to use that for a worship festival, but every 3 years they were rather to use that money, not for themselves, not for their worship, but to take care of the needs of the poor, the fatherless, the widows. Because God is concerned about His people, He is concerned that His people share in giving. And that has always been part of God's economy. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul was talking about his ministry to the Gentiles, and he wants them to know that the people in Jerusalem, Peter and James and the leaders of the Jerusalem church, were all for me going to the Gentiles, but all they asked was that we should continue to remember the poor, the very thing I had been eager to do all along. The ministry of Paul, taking the gospel to the uttermost parts of the world, just as Jesus said, contained in it an aspect of taking care of the poor. That was part of the missionary responsibility of the church. Contrast these two capital investment examples in the Bible. You know, churches have capital programs. Here's two different ones. The first one was raising money for the tabernacle. The Jews were expected to give gold and silver, whatever they had, to go into the construction of this building, this tent that would become the center of worship. But then Paul talks about a giving that was taking place among the Gentile churches to go back to the poor in Jerusalem. And he uses at Corinth, a very wealthy city, a very wealthy church, the example of the Macedonians, the Philippians, who gave so much. What these have in common, even though they're two totally different contexts, two totally different purposes in the giving, what they share in common is people gave more than was expected of them. They had to stop them from... Imagine when we were passing the baskets this morning, if all of a sudden the elders come running down the aisle saying, no, you've given too much, you need to stop. Now, that people gave sacrificially because they wanted to be a part of this grace of giving. That doesn't come naturally for most of us. We are by nature selfish. We want to use what we have for ourselves. I've mentioned this before, but I remember sitting up here watching it happen as the baskets were being passed, and parents, the reason that we don't send the kids to Sunday school until after the basket is passed, is we want to give parents a chance to teach their kids to give. So you give the child the quarter, or I guess it would be more than that today, but you give the child the money, and then sometimes you've got to do jujitsu to get them to turn loose of the quarter and drop it, because naturally they want to keep that. They don't want to give it. Well, God needs to do holy jujitsu on our hearts to get us to give, because it doesn't come naturally to us. Hence this series of lessons. Well, today we're going to look at 1 Timothy 6 and a series of words that Paul teaches to the rich. Now, at the beginning of the chapter, he is talking to people that just want to get rich. They're not necessarily rich yet, though some may have been. But he specifically speaks to those who want to be rich. And that's always a danger, because, as the old country song says, there'll be a load of compromising on the road to my horizon, but I'm going to be where the lights are shining on me. Now, if you can't appreciate Glenn Campbell, I'm sorry, I can't do anything for you. But yeah, that's the danger when we want to be wealthy, is that we'll make compromises along the way. And Paul talks about those who want to be rich, who have pierced themselves through with much grief. They've left the faith because they set their sights on being rich. But then at the end of the chapter, the part we're going to focus on, he turns and he speaks to those who are rich, which is interesting, because that reminds us, and maybe you need to hear this, it's not a sin to be rich. If you're rich, then you've got some responsibilities, and we're going to talk about that. But Paul doesn't tell the rich folks at Ephesus that they need to do a rich young ruler thing and get rid of all of their wealth so that they'll be poor like everybody else. He's going to tell them some things that they need to do. So we want to look and see we're going to look at 4 things that Paul is going to say to the wealthy. So before we start looking at those individual points, let's just read the text together. Perry's going to read this for us.
Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life.
Okay, I think we probably can break it up several different ways. But as I break it up, there's 4 words that are said specifically to those who are wealthy. Now understand, as we're going to mention, wealthy is kind of a comparative term. And so we don't know exactly how much wealth the people that he's speaking to in Corinth. But we're going to see 4 things that I think are not just going to apply to the people that we would say are wealthy, but to all of us here this morning. And that's really the first point. Command those who are rich in this present world. That's us. That's the first point. Anytime the Bible speaks to the wealthy, that's speaking directly to us. Remember, Jesus, in teaching us to pray, taught us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. Because many of the people he spoke to had a hard time getting enough to eat each day. For many people in the first century, their entire day was made up seeking for, working toward, and then preparing food for that one day. One meal a day was not that uncommon. And so to pray, give us this day our daily bread, is to recognize that there were some people that simply had to trust God to give it to them. You know what one sign of wealth was? One way you showed off that you're well-to-do in the first century? Obesity. People that were fat, that's just like driving a Cadillac today, right? That's the way you showed off your wealth, because you see, you had plenty to eat. So this idea of commend those who are rich, I think we need just to understand that's us. And we rebel against that, don't we? We're not rich. Elon Musk is rich. Bill Gates is rich. We're just comfortable. Okay, maybe we're just comfortable. But comfortable is pretty rich, the way that we define it anyway, the way we define comfortable. Here's how Paul defines comfortable. If we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. You see what he's saying? If we have enough to eat today, give us today our daily bread, and if we have clothes to wear, then that's enough to say that we're there comfortable. Most of us have way more to eat than one meal a day. We have plenty of food today. If you don't have enough food to eat today, you came to the right place because we got a lot of food down the hall and we're going to enjoy that together. We have so much. We need to understand that we are wealthy. Let's look at it this way. Suppose we'll take away your income and I'm going to give you $20 a day. You think you could live on $20 a day? I mean, you can do the math. That's probably a whole lot less than you make a week. But according to Pew Research, if you make if you live off of more than $20 a day, that puts you in the top 16% of the world's population. Now, we like to look at ourselves as being kind of average, maybe a little below average in income because we like to compare ourselves to the people around us, or particularly to the people on TV and all the things that they have. And God's got the whole world in his hand, right? He loves everyone the same. And so, therefore, if we compare ourselves to the entire world, we have been blessed beyond measure. And so, therefore, we just need to understand when God gives particular instructions to the rich, that is us. So that's the first point this morning. Then when the Bible talks about the wealthy, it's speaking to us. The second point is that giving shows where it is that we put our hope. So he tells those that are rich not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Okay, I want you to put a pin on that, everything for our enjoyment, because we're going to come back to that a little bit later. But he says you can put wealth and you put your hope in two things. You can put hope in wealth, but he warns us that if really your hope is in whatever wealth you have, if your focus, if your faith is in your money, you're going to be disappointed because that wealth is so uncertain. And we know that, right? Just look at the stock market or the job market or even the supermarket, the way things are getting so expensive. If we think that we're going to get by because of the wealth that we have, that can evaporate so quickly. That's the message of the rich fool, right? This guy that had so much and he had this bumper crop. He didn't even have the barns to store it. So he says, well, I'm going to tear down those barns and I'm going to build bigger barns and I'm going to retire and I'm going to sit back and I'm going to eat, drink, and be merry. And then God said, you fool. And then he dies that same night before he can enjoy any of the stuff that he's saved up. Now, it's not wrong to be rich. He wasn't a fool because he was rich. He wasn't a fool because he had a bumper crop. He wasn't a fool because he built bigger barns. He wasn't a fool because he retired. It's not a sin to retire, is it, David? Too soon to tell whether that's right. His problem was he did all of that and he didn't take God into account. He was not willing to share with others. His hope was in his money rather than in God. That same warning applies to you and I this morning. Paul makes it very plain that giving is a spiritual gift. He gives a list of spiritual gifts in Romans 12. And this not to be a complete list, but it gives us an idea of the things that Paul thinks that God helps us to do. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. And then he mentions a bunch of other things like encouragement, like leadership, like teaching. But he also says, if it is giving, then give generously. God allows some people to give in greater measure than others. And I would argue that's probably because he's given more stuff to some people than he's given to others, which allows some people to give more and more generously. But that's not to say that all of us, well, I don't have the gift of giving. Well, you still have to give. Just like there are some people that have the gift of encouragement. I mean, God has just given them a gift of encouragement. I mean, if you don't believe that, hang around Fred White for a while. You know, Fred is one of those that I would argue God is gifted with a special gift of encouragement. But that doesn't mean the rest of us are free to be, sticks in the mud that are, mean-spirited. We all have to be encouraging. I remember the old story of the kid that listened to the preacher preach this sermon about, we only need to encourage one another and so much as you see the day, those kinds of texts. And so he's going to be more encouraging. But that doesn't come easily to a lot of us. So he stood there talking to the first person he talked to, and he was trying to think of something complimentary to say, something to encourage them. And all he could come up with is, for a fat person, you don't sweat much. Yeah, I think encouraging is something that some people are just good at, but we're all called to be encouragers. We're all called to be givers. So how much do you have to have in order to be gifted in encouragement? Well, I would probably say more than $20 a day. We talked about that earlier. But the point here is, the second point, is that giving shows what it is that we put our hope in. If our hope is in wealth, then we're going to be stingy. If our hope is in God, then we're going to be much more willing to give. And then Paul says that our giving allows us to put our faith into action. So he says in verse 18, command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. It's easy to talk about our faith, but if we step out and really put that faith to action, that's a lot more difficult. And giving is one way that we do that. And what we tend to do is we tend to do future giving. We tend to push our, when I get to a certain point, then I'll be more able to give. When I get that new job, or when I get that raise, or when I win the lottery, I'm going to build a wing on that church building. You know what the lottery is, right? It's an extra tax on people that are bad at math. But we can always talk about the future. When something happens, that's going to allow us to really be able to give. And that means we just don't really understand blessings. That God blesses us with whatever it is he puts in our hands. And whatever he puts in our hands, we are blessed to bless others. And so just think, Paul said that if we just have enough food for today and enough clothes to wear, then we should be satisfied with that. So why does God give us more than that? Wouldn't God be doing us a favor just to give us just what we need, and then we wouldn't have to make these hard choices? Why does he give us so much? Remember that peg I had you put down? Paul said that he gives us everything for our enjoyment. God intends for you to enjoy the good things that he gives you. Why did God make food taste good? I mean, we're going to go back and we're going to enjoy some food together, some fellowship, talking over the tables, and we're going to enjoy that together, and we're going to have plenty to eat. And you know what's going to happen? After we eat plenty, we're going to eat some more. And because it tastes good. Why did God could make it so that we get our nutrients by sticking our fingers in the dirt and sucking it up just like a plant? But God made food taste good because he wants us to enjoy life. God really could have made us get babies from storks, but he came up with a whole different arrangement, right? God made life for our enjoyment. But if we only look at the things that God gives us in terms of how we can enjoy them, then we have completely misunderstood what God blesses us for. He blesses us in order to be a blessing to others. The early church found out this fact as they're together. They won the favor of all the people largely because of things just like this. Acts 4 verse 32. All the believers were one in heart and mind. We could stop right there. That's the first miracle of the early church. They were all in one accord. That's pretty good. But he continues. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. They gave because they didn't think of the stuff they had as theirs. It's what God has given us to bless others. Would that cause problems for them down the road? Absolutely. They're going to have to rely on some help later on when a famine hits Palestine. But because it's easy to give stuff away when it's not yours in the first place. And they understood that these blessings were given to them to bless others. So the third point that we can see from this text is that by doing good, by being rich in good deeds, is one way that we put our faith into action. And then finally, this is how we lay up treasures in heaven. This is, in this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Now, what Paul is doing here is sort of commentary, or at least doing a riff on what Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount when he tells us to make sure our treasure is in the right place. Store it for yourselves, treasures in heaven, where moth and vermin do not destroy, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Our heart follows our treasure. Works the other way around as well. But Jesus says our heart will follow our treasure. If our treasure is money and success and getting ahead in the world, then that's where our heart's going to be. But if our focus is in God, in the things of God, our treasure is going to follow that. If we put our treasure in the things of God, our heart will follow that. We have to understand that there is a correlation between how we use our money and what we think about God. Right across this license tag. My other car is a Rolls Royce. And it was on a Rolls Royce. You know, that's kind of ostentatious, wouldn't you say? You know what a great license tag would be? The words of that old hymn we sometimes sing together. My treasure is laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Jesus said that's where our treasure needs to be. And Paul tells us the way that we take the stuff that we have and store it up for ourselves in heaven is to use our blessings to do good. We get to keep what it is that we give away. That's how we lay up treasures as a firm foundation for the coming age. The statement that was one of the last prayer entries or journal entries in Jim Elliot's prayer diary before he was killed by the Indians that he had come to evangelize. It applies to all of us, right? It says, "He is no fool to give what he cannot keep, to gain what he cannot lose." And that's what God is telling us about the things that we do. When we do good with our money, then we lay up treasures that cannot be taken away from us. And as it turns out, that's a much better way to live your life than hoarding. That in reality, you take hold of the life that is truly life when you turn loose of your stuff and are willing to use it to do what's good. That can create a better life now. You know, when you give and you help somebody and you see them being helped by what you give, that releases serotonin and endorphins in your brain that's sometimes referred to as the giver's high. As it turns out, that's a better way to live your life than hoarding everything. You get more pleasure from that. It's more blessed to give than to receive, some wise person named Jesus Christ once said. There's an old story about a very, very wealthy man who received a message in a vision or during a dream from an angel that said, "You're about to die. You need to get your house in order." And the man begged the angel that he wants to take his wealth with him to heaven. And the angel said, you can't do that. That's against the rules. The rule is you can't take it with you. So I'm sorry. And the guy said, but please. And he bumped the request up to the main office. And finally, it came down to a certificate that said that he could take one suitcase of stuff with him to heaven. And so he converted all of his wealth to gold and stacked this big suitcase full of gold and drug it on to heaven. Now, I realize if you fill a suitcase with gold, you're not going to be able to carry it, but this is not based on a true story, in case you're wondering. And so he takes the suitcase, and he ends up at the pearly gates. And Peter, who's always there, of course, said, I'm sorry, you can't bring that in because, the rule is you can't bring it with you. And the guy goes, I got special permission. And Peter said, let me see that. Yeah, and he calls up, and sure enough. And then Peter is really perplexed. He said, what is so important that you would go to all this trouble to bring it to heaven? And so he zips the suitcase and looks inside, and then he looks up with a stunned look on his face and says, pavement? You brought pavement? Heaven is lined with streets of gold. Why would you bring pavement? Brothers and sisters, I'm afraid too many of us are spending our lives focusing on collecting pavement, when God wants to bless us in so many ways. But our hands are so full of the stuff that we're holding close to us. God tells through Paul those of us that are rich to be generous and willing to give, to do good, to use our blessings to bless others. Let's pray together.